Right. There we go.
Where is it? Oh, there it is. Right. Get rid of this. Okay. Republican Britain. This took place in what was called the interregnum between 30th of January 1649 and the 29th of May 1660, so just over 11 years. Oliver Cromwell, who you may have heard of, he holds the reputation of being the only commoner who was head of state, and he's the only person who ever united England, Scotland and Ireland by force of arms. And there's one thing that you've got to remember all the way through this is the importance of religion at this time. It was in the English Reformation and all what was going on in Europe, 30 Years' War and everything. So religion is very important. So the background, like I say, there's three great themes of the time: religion, the constitution, and taxation. Charles came to the throne on when did he come to the throne? I'll tell you. On 27th of March 1625. He was only aged 25. He wasn't. His older brother had died before him, so he wasn't expecting to be king. When he was king, he inherited a large fiscal deficit. Basically, Elizabeth and then James before him had spent all the money. He secretly married by proxy to a 15-year-old Catholic French princess called Henrietta Maria. And they first met in 1625 in person. And Charles delayed the opening of his first parliament until the marriage was consummated, so to forestall any opposition, because parliament was dominated by Presbyterians who became known as Puritans, which is a derogatory term. His main advisor was a guy called the Duke of Buckingham, who was pretty useless, really. He was trying to make deals with the French and the Spanish, and he ended up with an Anglo-Spanish War in 1625, which is highlighted by a lot of his disastrous plans to try and capture places on the continent. Charles called his first parliament what he called the useless parliament on the 18th of June that year, and there was no significant business transacted in that parliament. But the one thing it did, he refused to grant tonnage and poundage. Tonnage and poundage was what the parliament used to grant to the monarch for life, and that's how basically the monarch got their money. Tonnage and poundage was like a tax on different goods. So they didn't. They said they'd only granted him for 1 year, and he was annoyed at this. He took it as an insult, and so he dissolved Parliament without it being passed, and then started to collect it anyway. So that wasn't. He started to collect it anyway, which is not a good idea because it just annoyed people. So he convened a second parliament in December 1625, actually on the 25th of December. And that tried to impeach the Duke of Buckingham. So he dissolved that one as well. And then there was a war against the French. Again, the Duke of Buckingham was involved in that. And he was assassinated, nothing to do with Parliament. He was assassinated by a disgruntled ex-soldier. So Charles then had a third Parliament in March 1628, and then he prorogued it immediately until January 1629, and then he dissolved it in March. So his parliaments are not really working for him, or he doesn't think they are anyway. So we come to the period what's called personal rule. He has to somehow raise revenue without reconvening Parliament. So he resurrects an all but forgotten law called Distraint of Knighthood, which had been in abeyance for well over a century. And it required any man who earned £40 or more from land each year to present himself to the king at his coronation to be knighted. So, of course, nobody had done that because it hadn't been done for years. So he went round finding individuals who had failed to attend his coronation in 1626 to be knighted. And then the next thing he did is he imposed a feudal levy called ship money. And this was even more unpopular and more lucrative than the tonnage and poundage side. Previously, ship money was authorised to be collected during an emergency, like usually the French are going to invade, quick, we need some boats. And it was only levied on coastal towns and regions. Charles, however, he argued there was no legal bar to collecting the tax for defence during peacetime and throughout the whole kingdom. So he was collecting it from counties and towns right in the centre of England. Then he moved on to forced loans, which is basically you rock up at one of your subjects, one of your rich subjects, and you arrange a loan off them, which you both know you're never going to pay back, but you're sort of obliged to do it. And then the other big dispute with Parliament was that Charles was very into Arminian theology, and that basically the support of clerical authority, and which is sort of like what the Church of England ended up as. And the parliamentarians and the Presbyterians saw that as a potential vehicle for the reintroduction of Roman Catholicism. The Puritans thought he was far too sympathetic to them. And with him being married to a Catholic French wife, that only made things worse. So they opposed his desire to move the Church of England closer to the more ceremonial type of church, like the Catholic Church. In 1633, Charles then appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury, and that he started initiating a series of reforms to promote religious uniformity throughout England. Previously, each parish could decide on their own how they would operate. So they insisted that the liturgy be celebrated as prescribed by the Book of Common Prayer, and that the internal setup of a church should emphasize the sacrament of the altar. And Laud started to prosecute those who opposed his reforms through the Court of High Commission and the Star Chamber, the two most powerful courts in the land. And these courts became feared and for their censorship of opposing religious views. And they became unpopular with the property class for inflicting degrading punishments on gentlemen. Now, at this point, Charles was just about scraping along. He was doing all right at this point. He'd got his ship money and his monopolies and his forced loans, etc. If only he could avoid a war, he'd probably be all right. And then we go to the war that he got himself into. It's called the First Bishops' War in 1639. Charles and Laud decided that they would impose a Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Church and reappoint bishops that had been dismissed by the National Convention of Calvinists previously. Of course, this didn't go down well in Scotland. They were quite happy with what they'd got. So he tries to raise an army, which costs money, marches up to Scotland, but then his army basically doesn't get there because it's so badly supplied, and it just falls apart before he can do anything. So he starts to negotiate with the Scots, what's called the Scottish Covenant. But after the failure of that war, Charles was forced to recall Parliament. This is what's known as the Short Parliament, because he wanted to finance a second war. So he didn't manage to get much finance out of Parliament, but he went to war anyway, in the Second Bishops' War. This went even worse for him, because the Scottish Covenanters occupied the north of England. These bishop wars were the first ones, first start. It was the start of the War of the Three Kingdoms, which has become a name for all the wars that took place in England, Scotland, and Ireland at this period. So he was forced again to recall Parliament because the financial cost of these wars, and this became known as the Long Parliament because it went on for a long time until 1660. But during this Parliament, the King's main advisor, the Earl of Strafford, was impeached. This was due to he was a bit of a tyrant, really, but Parliament tried to get him on high treason, but they had difficulty proving it. I mean, he'd done a lot of things, but treason wasn't one of them. So when the trial collapsed, Parliament passed what's called a Bill of Attainder, which meant he could be found guilty just by a vote in Parliament, which he was. He had a vote and this said he was guilty. Charles was reluctant to sign his death warrant, but after rioting in London by the London mobs, he reluctantly agreed. So the Long Parliament was at loggerheads with Charles right from the beginning. And they passed an Act of Parliament that stipulated it could only be dissolved with the agreement of its members. And they presented a list of demands to the King. The Grand Remonstrance, as it was called, was a list of grievances. It was a mixture of constitutional and religious complaints and reforms, but it actually split the parliamentarians and drove some prominent MPs who had previously been critical of the King into the royalist camp. At the same time, it strengthened the resolve of those who opposed what they saw as a drift towards Roman Catholicism and absolutism. In 1641, there was a rebellion in Ireland, seemingly in support of the King's rights, and there was widespread violent assaults on Protestant communities in Ireland. In England and Scotland, rumours spread that the killings had the King's sanction, which for many foreshadowed their own fate if the King's Irish troops landed in Britain. So the English Parliament refused to pay for a royal army to put down the rebellion in Ireland. And instead, Parliament decided to raise its own armed forces, and the king did likewise. And in 1642, he left London, raised his standard in Nottingham, and that was the beginning of the First Civil War. So, the First English Civil War. To control the parliamentary forces, a committee of safety was formed, consisted of 5 members of the House of Lords and 10 from the Commons. There was no, at this time, there was no such thing as a standing army. What they had was trained bands for local defence, and each side had to raise their armies basically from scratch. There was 3 main areas where the armies were raised: one in the north, one in the west, and one in the east. And they were all raised from local recruits. And the first encounters of the Civil War were characterised by ineptitude, really, of the army commanders. And initially, the Royalists had the better of the opening, because they had a guy, Charles's nephew, called Prince Rupert, who actually was quite a good cavalry commander, up to the point of when he actually defeated the opposition cavalry, and then he used to just, him and his cavalry used to ride off, chasing anyone they could. So they were good, but they weren't disciplined. So now we come to the Solemn League and Covenant. Because things were going badly for Parliament, they sealed a military alliance with the Scots Covenanters. They were both fearful of Charles bringing over the rebellious Irish to fight alongside the Royalists. And in this, and when they did this alliance, Parliament promised that the Scottish system of church government would be adopted in England. And the Committee of Both Kingdoms replaced the Committee of Safety. But a rift again developed in the parliamentary camp between what was called peace camp, who thought the fighting was just a means to force Charles to negotiate a settlement, and the war camp, who argued that Charles could only be dealt with after he had been beaten militarily. And these 2 camps mirrored what became known as Presbyterians, who were more in the peace camp, who wanted the unified church along the lines of Scotland, and the Independents, who wanted religious freedom. There was also doubts about the 2 of the main parliamentary commanders, the Earl of Essex and the Earl of Manchester, after some debacles at Newbury and in Cornwall. And the parliamentarians decided what they needed was a single, well-trained army under one commander. So, the New Model Army. This was the first standing army in English history. It was commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax, and the cavalry commander was Oliver Cromwell. It was well-trained and disciplined, and the army also contained the most radical elements of the parliamentary cause. And there was initially some interference by Parliament, who tried to control the army and what it did, but it ended up defeating the Royalists at the final decisive battle of Naseby, and that was the end of the First Civil War. But Charles still stubbornly refused to admit defeat, and it turned out he had been in negotiations with the Irish rebels, promising Catholic toleration when, and now he began negotiating with the Scottish Covenanters, and Charles actually surrendered to the Scottish Covenanter army. So there's a pause in the fighting. Charles is now a prisoner of the parliamentarians, but they now are split into 3 factions. The Presbyterians, they want the king on the throne, constitutional reforms, compulsory Presbyterianism, and disband the New Model Army. There's a group led by the Earl of Essex, He wants an aristocratic-led monarchy with compulsory Presbyterianism. And then there's the independents and most of the New Model Army who want a king on the throne, constitutional reforms, and religious freedom. The Scots, on the other hand, wanted the king on the throne and compulsory Presbyterianism. As you can see from that, one of the common things is they all wanted the king on the throne. So at that point, no one was looking to dispose of Charles. All they wanted him is head of state with a new, some form of new constitution. But then Charles reopened talks with the Irish, and the Scots, who he was the prisoner of, decided they'd had enough, and they just thought, they went back to Scotland, and they sold Charles to the Presbyterians in return for payment of all their war costs. So there's growing discontent in the army. There's a petition from the army, and that basically arose because the Parliament thought they could rein in the New Model Army, and the plan was to send some to Ireland, and then those that were left behind could be disbanded. When the soldiers heard about this, they were very much against it. And the petition was based on payment of wages. They hadn't been paid for 40, 50 weeks or so. They wanted indemnity for any acts committed during the war because, you know, they'd been ordered to do things. So basically, they didn't want to be held up or put on trial for things that happened. Anybody who remained in the army should be paid on time, and anyone who volunteered cannot be forced to fight outside of England. They also wanted pensions for widows, children and wounded. In response, Parliament told the army, you've got to go to Ireland or be disbanded, and tried to replace Fairfax and Cromwell. This resulted in the soldiers electing spokesmen from their own ranks, and these are called agitators. Agitators were more or less like delegates or representatives. They drew up a list of demands and grievances, and they met with the senior officers, who became known as the grandees. But Parliament wouldn't budge, and it began organising support from the London trained bands, and they contacted the Scots for help, basically saying, look, if we need to fight the New Model Army, can you come down and help us? Fairfax and the rest of them heard about this, and he called for all the regiments to attend a general meeting at Newmarket and trying to arrange a settlement. At this point, a detachment of troops from the army rode to where the Presbyterians were holding Charles and managed to get him away into the army's custody. This was thought to be at the request of the agitators, but there's little doubt that Cromwell was well aware of it. Fairfax went and talked to each regiment and told them he was sympathetic and the grievances would be looked at, but discipline had to be maintained. And the result was a solemn engagement of the army, a pledge not to disband until Parliament met their demands. And then Fairfax led the army on a slow march towards London. The grandees, now having possession of Charles, started negotiations and drew up the heads of proposals, laying out constitutional change and religious freedom. Parliament, on the other hand, hearing about the negotiations, stirred up the London mob to intimidate any independent MPs and eventually expel them from Parliament, including the speakers from both the houses. These MPs and the speakers made their way to Fairfax and the army. Fairfax's plan was to march to London with the speakers and King Charles at the head of the new model army, if Charles agreed to the head's proposals. But Charles wouldn't. So Fairfax marched to London anyway, and he met no opposition as he reinstated the speakers and MPs, and then he paraded the army in Hyde Park as a show of strength. So now we come to the Levellers. The army was camped outside London, and a radical group emerged in the army known as the Levellers. They circulated a petition called the Case of the Army Truly Stated. In this, they attacked the grandees for betraying the common soldiers and demanded that Parliament be disbanded and negotiations with the king cease. It added that when the next Parliament is elected, it should be on the basis of universal male suffrage. This was rejected by the Army Council, the grandees. In response of the rejection, the Levellers presented a new document, the Agreement of the People. This went even further than the previous one. It went beyond the issues of the day and wanted the old order of king, lords, and commons to be abolished. It wanted political representation of the people, no forced impressment, voting rights, equality before the law, and liberty of conscience. In other words, religious freedom. So the Putney debates, Fairfax decided that he needed to get everyone together and try and thrash out some sort of solution. The Putney debates took place at the Church of St. Mary in Putney. That's why they call it Putney debates. Much of the recorded debate, because it was all written down, centred around the franchise. The radicals regarded the right to vote as fundamental to all free-born Englishmen, a right that had been won by fighting for freedom in the Civil War. Cromwell and his second command, Ireton, however, regarded the idea of manhood suffrage as tantamount to anarchy. They insisted that the vote should be restricted to property owners. This prompted some of the Levellers to ask what was in it for the ordinary soldiers who had been doing all the fighting. After several days of heated debate, both sides seemed willing to compromise to a certain extent. The Levellers agreed that servants and alms takers should be excluded from the franchise, and the grandees conceded that soldiers who had fought for Parliament should be granted votes. And one of the famous quotes coming from it is from Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, who was a Leveller. And his quote there basically is saying that everybody, no matter how poor, should be able to vote in the government that rules him. While all this was going on, So the Levellers were putting these proposals forward, and but the grandees were resistant to it. The Levellers hoped that it would be adopted by popular consent of the soldiers, and then pressed on Parliament and the nation. So, fearing the collapse of discipline and constitutional authority, there was a motion passed and carried at a meeting of the Army Council that it should be temporarily suspended. The agitators and representative officers were ordered back to their regiments. A new committee consisting only of officers was formed to draw up a manifesto in the name of Fairfax and the Army Council, which was presented to the troops in place of the Levellers' Agreement of the People. And then they proposed a general rendezvous. The proposed general rendezvous was then modified to 3 smaller reviews. And this resulted in a near mutiny at Cornbush Field when some leveller soldiers turned up unannounced, but it was suppressed. And while all this is going on, King Charles managed to escape. That sort of changed the situation. The new model army closed ranks at this point because as a second civil war threatened. And the representation of rank and file soldiers on the army council was quietly dropped and never raised again. So the second civil war, this is a bit shorter than the first. Charles ended up on the Isle of Wight, once again was put under house arrest by Parliament. But they kept on negotiating with him. In Parliament, there was a growing number who identified themselves as Commonwealth men who wanted, the very least, for Charles to be forced to abdicate. However, the Presbyterian members of Parliament allied with the Scots and offered Charles what's called the engagement, built around a 3-year trial of Presbyterianism, followed by a general debate. Charles agreed, and that cemented a military alliance with the Scots. Now, if you remember, this period of history was the Little Ice Age, and the harvest of 1646 had been poor. The winter and summer of 1647 and 1648 were both terrible, basically. So there was continuing uncertainty in the country. There was the threat of hunger. There was high taxes because they had to pay for the Civil War. And this caused a number of uprisings throughout England and Wales. So the new model army had to split up and deal with each situation. Just as they were getting everything under control, a Scottish Engager army crossed the border in support of the English Royalists. But they thought that English Royalists would rise and join them, but they didn't. And when the army finally met at the Battle of Preston, which took place in what is now Walton-le-Dale, the Engager army was no match for the new model army. It was defeated. And that was the end of the Second Civil War. So then we come down to the Remonstrance of the Army. It's a declaration, despite all this, Parliament carried on wanting to negotiate with Charles, but the army had definitely lost patience by this time. On the 15th of November, the House of Commons voted to allow the King to return to London and to restore his lands and revenues. So, fearing that Parliament intended to grant unconditional restoration, the army united behind the Remonstrance of the Army, drawn up by Henry Ireton. After some last-minute amendments to ensure the support of the Levellers, the Remonstrance was adopted by the General Council of the Army in November 1648. The Army's conviction was that Charles could not be trusted, and this only increased after intercepting messages he sent to an advisor stating any concessions he made were only to facilitate his escape. The Remonstrance proclaimed the sovereignty of the people under a representative government. Divine providence would prove the righteousness of otherwise the government's actions, and would also thwart unjustified rebellion against authority. Thus, the defeat of King Charles in the Second Civil War, for them, vindicated the actions of the army as defenders of the people. It was argued that the king should be brought to account because he had broken the sacred covenant with his people and attempted to place himself above the law. The Remonstrances also proposed a set of leveler-inspired constitutional reforms, including the possibility of an elective monarchy. Parliament was to set a date for its own dissolution, to be followed by annual or biannual parliaments elected on a reformed franchise. All office holders, including the monarch, were to subscribe to the levelers' agreement of the people. And then the discussion took place in the army about the possible dissolution of Parliament or a purge of members intent on continuing negotiations with Charles. So it was presented to Parliament on the 20th of November, but Parliament postponed discussion until treaty negotiations with the King could be completed. So the army had definitely had enough by this point, and the General Council resolved to march to London. Parliament still refused to discuss the Remonstrance and was intent on restoring Charles. And it was decided to use military force to purge Parliament of the King's supporters rather than simply dissolve it. This became known as Pride's Purge because the person who led the purge was Colonel Pride. His regiment of foot occupied, with some cavalry, occupied the Palace Yard and Westminster Hall and all approaches to the House of Commons, and other regiments patrolled the neighbouring streets. When the train band units that usually guarded Parliament arrived to take up their stations, they were ordered home. Colonel Pride had a list of MPs regarded as enemies of the army. Out of a total of around 470 MPs eligible to sit, about 180 were to be secluded or prevented from entering Parliament. A smaller number, regarded as extremists, were to be placed under arrest. At least 100 of the MPs on Pride's list actually stayed away from Parliament or fled from London. On the 12th of December, 5 of the most extreme Presbyterians, along with the Sheriff of London and a former Major General, were imprisoned at St. James's, accused of plotting the Scottish invasion of 1648. The purge was carried out on the orders of Henry Ireton. General Fairfax apparently had no knowledge of it, even though all the army actions were carried out under his name. Cromwell arrived back in London the day after the purge and announced his approval of the proceedings. By removing the MPs who still favoured a negotiated settlement, the purge effectively cleared the way for the King's trial the following month. Initially, only around 80 MPs sat in the purge Parliament, though their numbers increased after the execution of King Charles and the declaration of the Commonwealth in 1649. The purge Parliament became known as the Rump Parliament. So the King's trial. The Rump Parliament passed an ordinance for the trial of Charles I. He was charged with subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of the nation and with maliciously making war on Parliament and the people of England. In a reversal of traditional definition, Parliament declared that it was treason for a king to wage war on his own subjects. When the House of Lords refused to give assent to the ordinance, the House of Commons declared itself to be the supreme authority in the land, with powers to pass laws without the consent of King or Lords. A High Court of Justice was specially convened, and a total of 135 commissioners were nominated to sit in judgment, but around 50 refused to participate, and several more withdrew once the proceedings had begun. Charles refused to answer any of the charges against him. He refused to recognise the court, and challenged the House of Commons on their authority to represent the people of England. The final session was held on 27th of January, and he asserted that even the king was subject to the law, and the law proceeded from Parliament. So by that time, Charles knew the game was up. He was convicted of making war on his own people, and he was declared guilty of the charges against him, and sentence of death was read out, and he was executed soon afterwards. So the king's gone. The problem was the parliamentarians didn't really know what to do next. They passed a law abolishing the monarchy on the grounds that it was unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous to liberty, etc. And they did the same for the House of Lords, being useless and dangerous to the people of England. Lands that owned by the royal family and the church were sold, and the money was raised was used to pay the parliamentary soldiers. People were no longer fined for not attending their local church. However, everyone was still expected to attend some form of religious worship on Sundays. The country was now declared to be a Commonwealth and Free State under the rule of Parliament, and the government was entrusted to the Council of State under provisional chairmanship of Oliver Cromwell. The Levellers wanted Parliament to pass reforms that would increase universal suffrage. The soldiers also protested against the government. The most serious rebellion took place in London. Troops were ordered from the capital to Essex, but a group of soldiers led by Robert Lockyer refused to go and barricaded themselves in the Bull Inn near Bishopsgate. A large number of troops were sent to the scene, and the men were forced to surrender. General Fairfax ordered Lockyer to be executed, but at his funeral in April 1649, there was a dramatic reminder of the strength of the Levellers in London. Led by 6 trumpeters, about 4,000 people attended a procession, and many wore ribbons, black for mourning and sea green for the Leveller allegiance. A company of women also brought the rear, which is testimony to the active female involvement of the Leveller movement. Then there's an even more radical group known as the Diggers. They called themselves the True Levellers. To their critics, they were known as the Diggers. The name arose from their occupation of land named St. George's Hill in Surrey. On Sunday, the 1st of April, 1649, a small group of about 30 or 40 men and women started digging and sowing vegetables on the wasteland of St. George's Hill. They were mainly labouring men and their families, and research has shown that new people joined the community over the next few months. Many of these were local inhabitants. Their manifesto was printed at the same time, the True Levellers Standard Advanced. And in that, they put out their proposals. The work we are going to about is this: to dig up St. George's Hill and waste ground thereabouts, and sow corn, and to eat our bread together by the sweat of our brows. This was only the first of several digger communities that sprung up around the country. One by one, though, these communities were broken up by a combination of local landowners hiring men and troopers from the New Model Army and the New Model Army itself. Despite the apparent failure, the political risings of the diggers would establish them first at the time as an object of mockery, and as an ideological threat. Eventually were recognised as being way ahead of their time. Their programme was not moderate or Bonaparte measures, but they grasped the idea of the equality of people, not just as a meaningless slogans, and that equality of opportunity was meaningless if the parties concerned started from vastly different economic, social, and financial bases. They wanted to make the earth a common treasury, and the fundamental principle that they held to was work together, eat bread together, and they wanted to declare this all abroad. These ideas wouldn't come again for another 200 years. And then there's Ireland. The Irish Rebellion had been going on since 1641, but because of events in England, nothing had been done. Cromwell, like nearly all the Puritans, had been angered by the true and false allegations of atrocities. They were the alleged atrocities committed by Catholics on Protestant settlers. Many they were exaggerated. They were atrocities, but not as bad as they claimed. And there was a general view amongst the English that the Irish were culturally so inferior that their subordination was necessary and natural. Cromwell's first action on reaching Ireland was to forbid his army to pillage or plunder. And that couldn't have been enforced in earlier unpaid armies. And he actually helmed 2 men for plundering to convince the soldiers he was serious. But his subjugation of Ireland was brutal. At Drogheda, once the walls were breached, Cromwell ordered his troops to kill anyone bearing arms, and all priests. The troops took this literally, and a lot of people who weren't bearing arms were killed in the process. Parliament, though, were unwilling to pay for a long war. So Cromwell was told to take control of large estates owned by Catholic and sell them and rent them to Protestants. This money was then to be used to pay his soldiers. Cromwell decided that the best way to bring a quick end to the war was to carry out another brutal massacre. And after an 8 days siege at Wexford, troops, priests, and civilians were butchered there as well. During the next few years of bloodshed, it's estimated that about 1/3 of the population was either killed or died of starvation. The majority of Roman Catholics who owned land had it taken away from them, and they were sent to the barren province of Connaught, and the land given to President soldiers who had taken part in the campaign. Many Catholics were shipped to the Caribbean as indentured servants. There's a myth grew up around this that they were actually the Irish slaves, but they were indentured servants, which ain't much better, admittedly, but they weren't actually slaves. There was no attempt to convert the Irish Catholics to Protestantism, but the religion was outlawed in the hope that it would eventually disappear. Catholics were forbidden from taking part in public life, and priests were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The use of Irish Gaelic was banned, and the ancient bardic schools were shut down. This Cromwellian settlement of Ireland laid the foundation of the Protestant ascendancy, in which a dominant Protestant landowning class ruled over Irish Catholic tenants. Then he turns his attention to Scotland. Cromwell left the army in Ireland, and and returned to England and took command of a second English army preparing to invade Scotland. On the 3rd of September 1650, he defeated the Scottish Covenanters at the Battle of Dunbar. His forces occupied Edinburgh and Scotland south of the River Forth. Then Cromwell advanced the bulk of his army north, and there he was informed at this point that Charles II, or the future Charles II, was commanding a Scottish Royalist army and had invaded in England from his base in Scotland. So Cromwell left half his army to deal with the rest of Scotland, and he led the rest south in pursuit of Charles. The Royalist army failed to gather much support again from the English Royalists as it moved south, and it headed towards Worcester. The hope was that people in Wales and the Western Midlands of England would rise against the Commonwealth, but it didn't happen. And 1 year after the Battle of Dunbar, the New Model Army, the English Militia Regiment, vanquished the last Royalist army of the English Civil War at the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September 1651. That was the last and decisive battle in the War of the Three Kingdoms. The Republican English government planned to incorporate Scotland into the Commonwealth with England. The tender of union was presented to the Westminster Parliament on 21st of April, in March 1652, sorry. The Scots were not consulted, and it was proclaimed in Edinburgh on the 21st of April. The union included religious toleration across the two nations, excluding Catholics, of course. The forfeiture of all royal property and revenues, and Scottish representatives were authorised to be elected to the Westminster Parliament. There was no attempt to incorporate the Scottish legal system, but a new corps of judiciary was established in Edinburgh. Many of the magistrates that were English. 9 commissioners were appointed to regulate university and church, and an admiralty court was established at Leith, which had the responsibility for managing estates confiscated from the Royalists. Although all this happened in 1652, it took until 1657 when Cromwell was Lord Protector for the Act of Union to be passed by the Second Protectorate Parliament. Basically, what Parliament wanted was for Scotland and Ireland to be incorporated in the Commonwealth and the three nations ruled by central government. And that was going to happen for the first time in British history. At the same time, the Commonwealth government proceeded on an aggressive foreign policy based on naval power because they wanted to increase the revenues of the country. So we have the Anglo-Dutch War. The 1651 Navigation Act was passed. It was a general act, but it was seen to aim primarily at the Dutch. It stipulated that goods could be imported into territories of the English Commonwealth only by English ships. At the time, the Dutch were the major trading country in the world, and their ships transported goods all from Europe and the New World all over. The English Parliament wanted to stop this and for English ships to take over. So they passed this Navigation Act, which annoyed the Dutch. And so a war, it was a naval war. There wasn't actually any armies, but a naval war began. At first, both countries were getting ready for war, but neither were really ready. It was only started when there was an encounter between a Dutch and English fleet in the English Channel, and an ordinance of Cromwell's required all foreign fleets in the North Sea or Channel to dip their flag in salute on meeting an English fleet. There was some misunderstanding about this and some resentment, and although the Dutch did dip their flag, it was not given promptly enough for the English, so they opened fire, and that actually started the war after a brief battle at Dover. Right, so now, the Rump Parliament was never intended to be a permanent body. It regarded itself as an interim government with responsibility for preparing the way for a new representative government to govern the English Commonwealth, or the British Commonwealth as it was becoming. It was expected that elections would soon take place. However, Parliament was divided again over the format the new representative should take. So Sir Henry Vane and his supporters proposed a redistribution of constituencies, but with sitting members of the long Parliament retaining their seats and further recruiter elections to fill vacant places. The Commonwealth, though, was reliant on the army to maintain its authority, and Cromwell and the Council of Officers criticised Vane's scheme for promoting the self-interest of sitting MPs and demanded the general election of an entirely new Parliament. And during the early months of 1653, tension between Parliament and the army again increased as Parliament dragged its feet over preparations of new elections. At a conference of army officers and MPs in April 1653, Cromwell proposed that the parliamentary system be temporarily suspended and replaced with an interim council to govern while final preparations for an election were put in place. The MPs present agreed to suspend their discussion until Cromwell's proposal had been debated. The following day, however, Cromwell was incensed to learn that the discussions were continuing in Parliament regardless. So Cromwell decided to act, and the following morning he led a company of musketeers to Westminster. He addressed the members, first calmly and then with rising anger, and told them their sitting was permanently at an end and they must leave. And there's a famous saying, "In the name of God, go." At Cromwell's signal, musketeers marched into Parliament and drove out the MPs. Cromwell's exact reasons for expelling Parliament are still unclear. The traditional view is that he's come to believe that Parliament was planning to perpetuate itself by adopting Sir Henry Vane's scheme to allow sitting MPs to remain and fill vacant places with recruiters. This view has been questioned in recent time, but there's no clear explanations of its actions have emerged. And there was no plan for an alternative government in place, and Cromwell made no attempt to take power himself. And yet another group was emerging at this time, the Fifth Monarchists. The Fifth Monarchy, or Fifth Kingdom, refers to an interpretation of the prophecies in the biblical book of Daniel and Revelations. There were supposed to be 4 kingdoms or eras in history, and this was interpreted as the Assyrian or Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman empires. These would be followed by the Fifth Kingdom. They saw the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope as a continuation of the Roman Empire. So that the Fifth Kingdom would be a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, and it would last from the second coming to the day of judgment. So again, it's the importance of the religious view. A lot of the groups took their inspiration from passages in the Bible. Oliver Cromwell, when he forcibly dissolved Parliament, was hailed by the Fifth Monarchists as the second Moses, leading God's people to the Promised Land. And congregations around the country issued declarations of support and expressed the hope that Christ's kingdom was dawning. And the Fifth Monarchist political influence reached its peak in the nominated assembly, which was also known as bare bones Parliament, which governed the Commonwealth for 6 months. Right, the bare bones Parliament. That was named after one of the members, one of the poorer members of the Parliament, whose name was Pray God Barebone. So, following the expulsion, having argued for elections, the Council of Officers, the Army Council, was reluctant to authorise them because they were worried that Presbyterians and Royalist sympathisers might be returned. So there was different schemes discussed to replace a discredited Parliament. One was a body similar to the Council of State with powers limited by a written constitution. And then one of the Fifth Monarchists called for a ruling body based on the Old Testament of elected saints. The members of the new assembly were actually nominated by the Council of Officers and approved by the Council of State. There was 140 delegates, 129 representatives for England, 5 for Scotland, 6 for Ireland. The Scottish and Irish delegates were actually English soldiers that were serving in those countries. A further 5 members, including Cromwell, were later co-opted into the assembly. But Sir Thomas Fairfax, who was the most prominent of a handful of nominees, declined to take part. The nominated assembly, bare bones, first met in July 1653. It assumed the title of Parliament of the Commonwealth, even though it wasn't elected. During its brief life, it actually passed 26 ordinances dealing with a wide range of administrative, financial, and social matters. This included the requirement that all marriages be performed not by the clergy but by a justice of the peace, compulsory civil registration of birth, marriages, and deaths within each parish, greater protection for lunatics, and provision of relief of impoverished debtors and prisoners. So they did quite a lot of work. As with the Independents and Presbyterians in the Long Parliament, the Assembly then polarised between moderate and radicals. The moderate tendency was growing alarmed at moves that regarded as an attack on the patronage and the threat of the rights of property owners. So, with the tacit support of Major General Lambert of the new model army, moderates organised for the dissolution of the nominated assembly. And how they did it was they coordinated an early morning meeting on the 12th of December, when most of the radicals didn't actually tell any of the radicals, so most of them were absent. And the Parliament voted to deliver up to the Lord General Cromwell the powers which they received from him. Led by the Speaker, around 40 MPs walked to Cromwell's residence at Whitehall, where to his surprise, they formally abdicated their authority to him. Around 30 radicals who had happened to turn up were driven out by soldiers. So this is where we get the beginning of the Protectorate. They presented the instrument of government, a constitutional settlement drafted by Major General John Lambert. It was adopted by the Council of Officers, and then the nominated assembly surrendered its powers to Cromwell in December. Lambert's original intention had been that the old constitution of King, Lords and Commons should be replaced by one of King, Council and Parliament. Cromwell amended the instrument to avoid reference to a royal title, which he felt was likely to be unacceptable to the army. But it turned out, with the changes and Cromwell being Lord Protector, it was England's first written constitution. Under the terms of the instrument of government, executive power passed to an elected Lord Protector in consultation with a Council of State numbering between 13 and 21 members. Cromwell was declared Lord Protector for life, though it was stressed that the office was non-hereditary. And he was required to call triennial parliaments consisting of a single house of 400 members from England, 30 each from Scotland and Ireland. And they had to remain in session for at least 5 months. The franchise, though, was restricted to persons with land or property valued at 200. And this is a direct repudiation of the level of ideas. Of course, Roman Catholics and known royalists were declared ineligible to vote or seek election. Liberty of worship was granted to all, again, Roman Catholics, and those guilty of licentiousness. That meant people like the diggers or the levellers. The first Protectorate Parliament was summoned under the terms of the instrument of government and consisted of those 400 English and Welsh MPs, with the additional ones from Scotland and Ireland. It was the first Westminster Parliament in which Scotland and Ireland were actually represented. Members drew up a series of amendments to the instruments of government aimed at strengthening Parliament's powers and reducing the strength of the army and restricting moves towards religious tolerance and more power to be transformed to Parliament alone. This angered and frustrated Cromwell, who then dissolved the first Protectorate Parliament in January 1655, which was the earliest opportunity allowed under the terms of the instrument of government. The actual instrument of government specified the Parliament should meet for a minimum period of 5 months. Cromwell interpreted that as a period of 5 lunar months rather than 5 calendar months. The sealed knot. I think everyone's heard of the sealed knot, the group of reenactors who go around the country reenacting battles of the Civil War. The name actually comes from a group formed by Charles, Prince of Wales, or future Charles II. He commissioned them to coordinate underground royalist activity in England, and it began operations in 1654. However, the sealed knot proceeded too cautiously, and a more militant group was formed called the Action Party, and that made preparations for a series of coordinated royalist uprisings around the country. Unfortunately for them, John Thurlow, who was Cromwell's very efficient spy master, knew all about the plot, and it was firstly postponed, and then when it was actually put into place, there was only one uprising, Penruddock's uprising, and that was easily dealt with by one company of troopers. So Cromwell decided his attempts to cooperate with civilian politicians is at an end, and he imposed direct military government on England and Wales under the rule of the Major Generals. So the rule of the Major Generals was a 15-month period of direct military government. The the failure of the first Protectorate Parliament meant that Cromwell just wanted to get things done his way. And those royalist uprisings convinced him that the stringent security measures were needed. And finally, he also believed that the godly reform of the nation's morals were required. So the major generals were tasked with that. The country was divided into 12 regions, 10 in England, Scotland, and then Ireland, each governed by a major general who was answerable only to the Lord Protector. So the first duty was to maintain security by suppressing unlawful assemblies and disarming any royalists. To assist them, they raised cavalry militias and had a decimation tax, which was a punitive tax on royalists as a mean of financing the militia. They appointed commissioners to supervise the collection of the tax and enforce moral reform on their localities. So pastimes like horse racing, stage plays, cockfighting, bear baiting were abolished. There was laws against drunkenness, sexual licentiousness, blasphemy, swearing, and unruly alehouses were closed. While the major generals were actually successful in law enforcement and curbing security threats, their attempts at reforming the nation's morals were a different matter. They varied immensely from region to region. During the rule of the major generals, the Second Protectorate Parliament was called, as again there was an urgent need to raise finances to continue a war that they got into with the Spanish. That was done by again after beating the Dutch in the Anglo-Dutch War. Cromwell decided to send his navy to the West Indies to capture Hispaniola, which they failed, but they managed to capture Jamaica. But it was a bit of a disaster, but it actually cost a lot of money at the same time. The major generals convinced Cromwell that they could manage the elections to produce a favourable result. So they discouraged unsuitable candidates and did their best to influence voting. But the resentment against the high taxing military rule of the major generals ensured that a lot of opponents of the Protectorate were returned. The results were vetted by the Council of State, and out of approximately 400 MPs returned, 93 were judged ungodly and prevented from taking their seats. Even though the MPs were vetted during its first session, they rejected a bill that would have made the decimation tax permanent and to renew the rule of the major generals. This meant that the rule of the major generals was probably it couldn't be maintained. So the system was abandoned in 1657 under the new constitution, the humble petition and advice. The humble petition and advice was an attempt to, firstly, to offer Cromwell a crown, but also to move back to a traditional form of government after the army-led constitutional experiments. Cromwell, as I said, was offered the crown, but he refused it. And he was offered the crown by Parliament because they saw it as a way of actually reigning in his power, because his power would be defined by precedent. He actually had more power than any ruler at the moment, any monarch. it included proposals for a second House of Parliament, a national church, confession of faith, but the most controversial proposal, that the Protector would be king, was eventually removed after opposition from the army and religious radicals and Republicans. And in the end, Cromwell himself decided against it. In the revised version of the proposal, though, Cromwell was reinstalled as Lord Protector in a ceremony which was very similar to a royal coronation. The other changes were that he could now choose his own successor, and the Parliament would consist of two chambers, the House of Commons and an upper house referred to as the other house. The Council of State was to become the Protector's Privy Council, chosen by the Protector and approved by Parliament. National Church was established. So this is the second and last written constitution for England. It was opposed from the beginning by the Commonwealth men, who were who challenged the legitimacy of the upper house and wanted a return to the old Commonwealth idea without any king or protector. Cromwell was alarmed that some of these ideas seemed to find favour within the army. So he stopped all petitions for this and dissolved the Second Protectorate Parliament 2 weeks after it had been reconvened. And then the end of the Protectorate. Oliver Cromwell died in September 1658. But before he died, he nominated his eldest surviving son, Richard, to be the Protector. Despite murmurings of discontent by Republicans and army radicals, Richard's successor was generally accepted by the nation as a whole. However, once again, the Protectorate's financial situation was dire. Richard inherited a huge national debt, and there was huge pay arrears for the armed forces. So he had to try and pacify his critics amongst the senior army officers. He actually convened Parliament again in an attempt to deal with the Protectorate's financial crisis. The electoral reforms had been introduced by the instrument of Parliament. But the council decided to revert back to the 1653 franchise and arrangement of constituencies for the third Parliament. This was again viewed with suspicion by opponents of the government. And the council also decided to retain MPs sitting for Scotland and Ireland and the nominated upper house. These were all controversial, but unlike the other parliaments, there was no attempt to exclude MPs hostile to the government, and all those elected took their seats. There emerged a Protectorate party, headed by Cromwell's old spymaster, John Thurlow, and a Republican Commonwealthman, the old rump who wanted to return to the pre-Protectorate Commonwealth. In the end, Richard was recognised as the new Protector, but stipulated that the Protector's powers should be more clearly defined. A new Convention Parliament assembled on the 25th of April, and soon afterwards it welcomed what was called the Declaration of Breda. Parliament had been negotiating with Charles II, and he promised lenience and tolerance if he was restored. He promised liberty of conscience, and the Anglican Church policy would not be harsh. He would not exile past enemies or confiscate their wealth, and he would pardon nearly all his opponents except the regicide, the actual people who signed the death warrant for his father. He also, the crucial thing was he also promised to rule in cooperation with Parliament. The English Parliament resolved to proclaim Charles king and invite him to return, and he did so. First, he was proclaimed king in Ireland, and then in May 1660, he was proclaimed King of England and Scotland. And that was the end of the Republican period of Britain.